We're on the fourth of our series looking into the life of Abraham, entitled Following God's Promise. And this week we're looking very much about dealing with doubt in chapters 15 and 16. So I'm going to read chapter 15 to begin with. We'll get to 16 later. Later the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision. Abram, don't be afraid. I will protect you and reward you greatly. But Abram answered, Lord all-powerful, you have given me everything I could ask for, except children. And when I die, Eliezer of Damascus will get all I own. You have not given me any children, and this servant of mine will inherit everything. The Lord replied, No, he won't. You will have a son of your own, and everything you have will be his. Then the Lord took Abram outside and said, Look at the sky and see if you can count the stars. That's how many descendants you will have. Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord was pleased with him. The Lord said to Abram, I brought you here from Ur in Chaldea, and I gave you this land. Abraham asked, Lord, how can I know the land will be mine? Then the Lord told him, Bring me a 3-year-old cow, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a dove, and a young pigeon. Abraham obeyed. Then he cut the animals in half and laid the 2 halves of each animal opposite each other on the ground. But he then did not cut the doves and the pigeons in half. And when the birds came down to eat the animals, Abraham chased them away. As the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and everything became dark and frightening. Then the Lord said, Abraham, you will live to an old age and die in peace. But I solemnly promise that your descendants will live as foreigners in the land that doesn't belong to them. They will be forced into slavery and abused for 400 years, but I will terribly punish the nation that enslaves them, and they will leave with many possessions. 4 generations later, your descendants will return here and take the land, because only then will the people who live here be so sinful that they deserve to be punished. Sometime after sunset, when it was dark, a smoking cooking pot and a flaming fire went through the 2 halves of each animal. At that time, the Lord made an agreement with Abraham and told him, I will give your descendants the land east of Shihor River, on the border of Egypt, as far as the Euphrates River. They will possess the land of the Canaanites, the Kezanites, the Commodamites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Gershonites, and the Jebusites. Abraham has been living in the land some years now. He's had a bit of a bad time because he's had to flee into Egypt at a time of drought, and he's had to sort his nephew out, Lot, who got mixed up with some of the kings of Canaan, got captured, was made a slave, and he had to run off and rescue him, and he successfully does that. And we left last week with the fact that Lot then met up with Melchizedek, this strange figure that figures prominently in New Testament history, but very little is said in Old Testament history about him. But it's obvious that Melchizedek is another God believer. There are not many God believers around at this time, not even in amongst Abraham's followers, his family. And so this is a great uplift to Abraham in his faith. But the promises that God had made about giving him children still had not been fulfilled. And on this occasion, Abraham, when he's talking to God, asked God directly, "You promised me children, and I still haven't got any children." And God comes back with further promises to him. And Abraham believes. This obviously shows that Abraham, although he'd been following God for some years, still had his doubts. And we must realise, as God's people today, that doubts are often part of our lives too. How did Abraham deal with the doubts? How do we deal with the doubts? It's something that we can learn from the life of Abraham, and indeed many other Christian people today. Having doubts is not a sin. It's part of our life in the kingdom. So I was thinking about this, I was very much thinking of, we spent some time on the film Young Messiah there, and there's a passage in there that talks and speaks about doubt of Jesus' mother, Mary. Remember that film? Many of us saw, or we did some sessions on. Just a reminder, really, that even the most well-known of God's faithful people have doubts sometimes. While we're talking about Christian films, there's a film on Samson's life coming to the screens next month, which I've seen some trailers of, and that looks pretty good as well. It's done by a Christian company. So we've been blessed with Christian films in these last few years. But back to where we are. Abraham has had success. Now he's still got no child. The delay causes him to doubt. But God tells him quite blankly, "No, your servant won't inherit all your possessions and property and money. Your son will." And that's enough for Abraham to walk on in faith, still believing God. So we've got this circle, really, of response, of doubt and faith. Doubt and faith. And God calls him to one spectacular visual aid, asking him to look up at the heavens and count the stars. And I always think about that as I walk out with the dog every night. I don't have much trouble counting the stars because of all our light pollution, which really spoils it, isn't it? But there's a lot of things with the heavens that remind us spectacularly. Do you all see the special moon this week? Jamie, do you see the special moon? Bright? Did it look brighter and bigger to you than normal?
Yeah, I didn't see it that colour, but...
No, I would imagine somebody's done a bit of photoshopping on that picture, but, it possessed a bit that. But I'm often reminded when I get verses like that in Scripture. I spent a period of my life out in the West Indies where there were no street lights, and there was always a mass of stars like that, thousands of them in every inch or so. So, isn't it amazing? If you ever get to a chance to get really out in the country and look up, you'll see far more stars than what you do walking around Reading or Caversham, because we're blighted, really. But it's magnificent, isn't it? What a wonderful illustration God gives him. This is the number of children that you will have, and of course that has come true to Abraham, but he had to wait. But God keeps on promising Abraham, and Abraham seeks to be faithful to that promise. And then we come up to this sacrifice, this strange sacrifice. It's a covenant where the animals are laid out. 3 big animals and some small animals. They're cut. And God comes down with a blaze in furnace and goes through them as a sign of a covenant. You remember what covenants are? Let's just go back into remind us what covenants are. Covenants, the image of covenant or agreement, is the primary way in which the Bible portrays the relationship between God and his people, and to a less extent to the human race in general. While many horizontal relationships are described as covenantal, including marriage and various pacts between friends or among enemies, the Bible's image of covenant focuses primarily on the covenant between God and man. God promises through a covenant. It's like a contract. It's not a written. We have written contracts today. Many of us have them or had them in work situations. We sign contracts, don't we, when we agree to buy houses and borrow loans and all that sort of thing. We're used to it. But this is how God did it. They laid out sacrifice of animals, which meant, and they were in public, to state covenants. And this was a tradition all over what we call the ancient Near East at the time. And God brings covenants into his relationship with people. So the people, Abraham would have been used to covenants. If you looked at that, we saw some scenes of the film Abraham, but that starts off with a covenant scene in his town of Ur, where the king makes promises with Abraham, and they sacrifice animals to give him grazing rights and water rights. But so this is something that's based on tradition, but God brings it into the life of ordinary people, making promises that he keeps. More often than not, these promises don't require any response from the person God is making a covenant with. God is not asking Abraham on this occasion to make any promise in return. God is promising it and brings this sort of vision before him of making the promise. And it means so much to Abraham. So Abraham's vision through this covenant promise says, your offspring shall be aliens in a land that is not theirs, and they shall be slaves there, and they shall be oppressed for 400 years. Now we can look back in history, can't we, and understand that covenant did come true. It didn't come true in Abraham's lifetime. Yes, he did have one son, but that wasn't a nation and descendants like thousands. It did become true. And it says in the book of Hebrews, in chapter 11:13, when it's talking about Abraham and other people, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. So here is God promising Abraham that this will all come true. And Abraham understands that some of it will come true after he's died. But his relationship with God was such that he believed that. He believed that God would fulfill his promises, and perhaps not all of these promises would come through in that his lifetime. So Abraham's predicament is not too far from that of later generations of God's people. Abraham too must wait in faith for the fulfilment of the promise, being counted righteous in his faith, but realising that the promise was far off to another generation, says one particular Bible commentator. So this is all to do with understanding how God makes promises to us. God may promise us many things during our life, and all these promises will come true, but not necessarily, like Abraham, within our lifetime. This is what covenants is in this setting up of the history of God's people in the book of Genesis. Go on. We understand this because there's lots of it written. This is it down in Genesis again. Let me read this passage to you. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain, that your offspring will be sojourners in the land that is not theirs, and they will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. So this is what God is promising Abraham, and he takes this on for belief. But we can look back at this, and history looks back, that the promises God made to Abraham did come true, and his prophetic vision was true. Abraham, we know, had at this time 390 men who were capable of going for battle. So he must have had a clan then of about over 1,000. And that grows under Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and everything into a whole nation. So much so that what God promised Abraham came true, because his tribe, his descendants, did grow into a big nation that frightened the Egyptians, didn't they? That was one of the reasons why, when we was looking at the story of Moses in house group this week, that the Egyptians tried to keep the population of the Hebrews in check by asking the midwives to kill all the children. It didn't work out, but they got such a nation, and eventually Moses went there and brought the people out of Israel, and hundreds of thousands came out of Egypt with lots of possessions, because the Egyptians, the ordinary people, wanted them to go so much. They gave them gold and silver and animals and everything to get rid of them, because they were so fed up with the plagues that God was sending them. So all this did come true. Abraham is portrayed as one who has reason to fear that God's promises will not be fulfilled. From all the appearances around him, Abraham has little to give him hope that God will remain faithful to his word. Abraham was still childless, and all his possessions one day would go to the hands of the man from Damascus. That was what he felt, but that's not how it all turned out. So I think we can see from this too that Abraham wasn't afraid to ask God why the promises God hadn't come to fruition. And God answers it. Surely that's a sign that we can see and learn from Abraham's life, that we shouldn't be afraid of asking God about the promises he's made to us that haven't come to fruition. You know, we have to trust God that these will come true, because God is always true to his word. God promised, Abraham believed, and that made Abraham a faithful servant in God's eyes. That's recorded for history. So the covenant is confirmed through this sacrifice and this smoking fire pot that went through these divided animals as a sign of what's going on. Okay, let's move on now to Haggai and Ishmael in chapter 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my servant, perhaps I can build a family through her." Abraham agreed to what Sarai said. So Abraham had been living in Canaan that time 10 years. Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian servant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abraham, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your servant is in your hands," Abraham said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was a spring that was beside the river to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress," Sarai answered. "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone and everybody's hand against him, and he will live in hostility towards all his brothers." She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me," she said. "I have seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered." So Hagar bore Abraham a son, and Abraham gave the name Ishmael to the son she had borne. Abraham was 86 years old when she bore Ishmael. So we've got a divergence here, haven't we? Sarah and Sarai, after all these promises, stop off, take a different direction from what God's plan was. God was promising that Abraham and Sarai would have children, and it wasn't happening. God promised, God made a covenant, Abraham believed, and then the next we hear that Sarai is offering her servant, Hagar, the Egyptian servant she picked up in Egypt, to him to produce children. Now this is not unusual in ancient Near East history. This was the sort of thing that was quite routine, but it was not something that God wanted of Abraham and Sarai to listen to. He really wanted them to keep with faith with him, so later people would know that God would be faithful to his people, and especially to those who were obedient to him. But Sarai couldn't cope with this social problem. It would have been a social problem. Barrenness in that age was frowned upon, quite honestly, because they believed that it was right that married couples had children. They had no other concept of being in a marriage with no children. But it's a theme that goes right the way through the early life of God's people here, and people have to have faith and be patient for God to give them the children that he promises all of them. So they take a step back here. But remember, although they take a step back and don't follow God's word, God doesn't punish them for it. God doesn't come out with his big stick and tell them that you've done wrong and disobeyed him. He still seeks to work quietly in the background, ask them to hang on to that faith. So we don't see or learn anything from the scriptures that God disapproves of what Abraham and Sarah's actions were. But we have to recognise that that was not what God wanted. And so that helps us learn to hang on to God's promises, even though that might be a bit difficult. Just one other thing. From here we need to recognise that God's promises here, what have I written there? As Abraham's faith grows and God's promises fruit, Sarah sees herself as an increasing failure in her marriage. And that is quite sad, isn't it? But we must hang on to the faith God's going. One other thing here, we recognise that God has got perfect timing for all these events and his promises. And what was true in the Old Testament is true in the New Testament and is true for us now. We need to often, I think, pray for patience. Because if we look at the story of Abraham, I hope we all know the ending. The promise that Abraham would have children does come true. Despite the attempts of Abraham and his wife to circumvent God's will, it does come true. And it's seen as a great miracle of faith. We also should remember that it's a great test of faith, being patient. And so, let's pray, let's ask questions of God and of others to help us in our quest when we feel that God's promises are not coming true.